Welcome to Full Stack Flask. I'm Sumit Sridhara. I work at AngelList, and I used to help teach computer science at UC Berkeley using Python and Flask to thousands of students. In this course, I've taken the lessons I've learned from building production-grade web applications in Flask, as well as from teaching Flask, and turned it into the course that I wish I had. This course takes a project-based, hands-on approach to learning Flask. It's split into two parts. The first is one where we go over the basics of Flask and how to structure your applications to scale. In the second part of the course, we're going to build a larger Flask application that's modeled off of a business that's doing millions of dollars a year in revenue. This is where we're going to handle things like plugins, sending emails, and deploying to production. You'll also receive access to a SaaS boilerplate application, which will handle a lot of the tricky parts of building SaaS applications for you. This will save you a lot of time in your next project that uses Flask because it will handle things like user authentication, recurring billing, admin dashboards, and a whole lot more for you right out of the box. When you're done with this course, you're going to be able to quickly build SaaS applications using Python and Flask. As part of the course, you'll get access to all of the course materials, including the source code for every project we build, videos for each module, and the actual manuscript for the book. I'm really excited to dive into Flask, and I'll see you in the course.
In today's video, we're going to be going over how to build our very first Flask application. Now, before we get started, there are a few things we'll need to set up first. The most important one is installing Python 3. If you're on a Mac running OS X or are running Ubuntu, chances are this is probably already pre-installed. If you're using Windows or Python 3 is not already installed on your system, there are detailed installation instructions located in the manuscript as well as in the appendix. You also need a text editor. The one we use is called Visual Studio Code, but you can use whatever text editor you're comfortable with. And then the next one is a terminal. You'll need to be able to open a terminal to run commands to start Flask applications. Once you have these installed, we can get started by building our applications. In this course, we're going to go over building multiple applications, and one thing that you'll discover is that it's possible for these different projects to have dependencies on different versions of libraries or even different versions of Pythons. And so as a result, we can run into some conflicts naturally if there is a discrepancy between our projects. And the solution to this discrepancy is to create virtual environments. Virtual environments allow us to isolate the version of libraries that we're using, as well as which Python version we're referring to specifically for each project. This helps ensure consistency both between projects, but also across developers, and so you can ensure that everyone's working on the same Python version as well as the version of libraries that you use for your project. You can visualize virtual environments somewhat like this, where each application folder has its own virtual environment that points to a specific version of Python that it needs, as well as a specific version of libraries that it needs. We'll be going into more detail later, but this is just some context before you start creating virtual environments. In this project, we're going to be building something to simulate dice rolling. So I noticed that I don't actually have any dice in my home, so I wanted to write a quick Python script to turn and tell me random numbers. Now, our finished application is going to look something like this. It's not very fancy, but it does the job. And it's doing the job based on a simple Python script. This is one thing that's neat about Python is we're able to write this logic in essentially 4 lines of code. And now to turn it into a web application, thanks to Flask, we can do that in only an additional 3 lines of code. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. And then we'll go over a larger Flask application that we're going to build using what we learn in the next video. Let's go ahead and build our first Flask app. The first step is to go into our terminal and create a folder for all of our projects. So in our terminal, I've created a folder here called Flask. Now, within it, I'm going to make a new folder for our first Flask app. Now that I'm here, one thing I want to do is I want to verify that we have Python 3. So I can type this to open up an interpreter, and now I can run Python code. For example, I can do 1 + 1, or I can say print hello, and that works. So that means we have Python 3 installed and it's all set up. Now I want to open this folder in our text editor, and to do that I'm going to type code dot, and what that does is that opens VS Code in our current folder. So once I hit this, I can take into VS Code here, and within VS Code I can actually go ahead and create a new file. So I'm going to call my file server.py. So here in server.py I can write Python code. For example, I can say print hello, and then when I go back to my terminal, I can run Python 3 server.py, and it prints hello. Now, if you remember in our slides, we went over a really simple function of how to get random numbers. Let's go ahead and paste that into our own terminal. So here I have the code to generate random dice, and I can verify that by going back in our terminal and running python 3-i server, and this runs interactively, so I have a console, and so now I can call the roll dice function, and then that'll give me a random number. All right, so we now have a functioning Python script. Now our job is actually to install Flask and turn this into a web server. To do that, we're actually going to go ahead and set up a virtual environment first. So the way we're going to set up a virtual environment is by running python 3 -m, and venv is the name of the virtual env module, and we're going to create one inside of a folder called env. Now that I've done this, you can see that there's now a folder in env, and I can run a script located in the env folder, and now I'm inside a virtual environment. So if I run Python here, it'll point me to the right version of Python. I can also run which Python to see which version of Python it's pointing to me to, and you can see it's pointing me to a version of Python that's within this folder. Now that we have Python and a virtual environment all configured, we can actually install Flask. And to do that, we're going to use the Python package manager and run pip install Flask. Now what this does is it installs Flask and all of its dependencies so that we're ready to go. And this means that we can now import Flask. And once we have that and that works, we can do that within our code as well. So here in our VS Code editor, we're going to want to also import Flask. And we can do that up here. You can say import Flask. Now we're going to have to define our application. So the way we can do that is we can say Flask, and we have to initialize it with a name. The standard is to initialize it with the name of the Python module that we're running. And the way we can do that is by using this _name method that's available in in Python that gives us the name of the module. And so what we want to do here is we don't just want to import Flask, we actually want to import the class Flask. So from Flask, import Flask. And then we've created an application here. And then the last line of code we're going to need is app.route. And so this is telling Flask to route all requests to our web server at the root URL to this function, and then just return whatever gets returned here. Now, let's go ahead and try and run that within our terminal. In order to run that, we're going to have to specify a few things for Flask, namely that our Flask app is in server and that our Flask environment is in development. But once we specify those two environment variables, we can actually just type Flask run, and that actually starts a web server. So we can go ahead and check Firefox here and refresh a page that's going to localhost port 5000. And then once we see that, we see the dice rolled 1. And then if we continue to refresh the page, we see random numbers here. So that's pretty cool. We've just spin up a Flask application in 3 additional lines of code. Pretty sweet, right? In the next few videos, we're going to go over building something a little more complicated and maybe more useful as well. Hey folks, welcome back. In this section, we're going to talk about building a larger Flask application. Specifically, what we're going to work on is a minimalistic version of Google Finance. Initially, it's just going to tell us the stock price of a particular stock ticker, but we can also extend it to include more information like financial metrics here. Now, you might be wondering, where are we getting this data? And the answer is we're talking to a third-party API. To do that, we're going to use a Python library named requests to make actual HTTP requests to a third-party endpoint, which we'll go over soon. So to get started, let's go back in our terminal. We have our Flask project folder, and within it, we have our existing Flask application. Let's go ahead and make a new folder called stock app here. And once we're in it, we're going to have to set up a few things. The very first thing I do is I set up a virtual environment. And we have to activate our virtual environment. So here we see our virtual environment and Python is all set up. Now the next thing we want to do is we actually want to specify the requirements of libraries we're going to be using. So in this application, we're going to be using both Flask as well as the request library. Instead of just running pip install Flask and pip install requests, we're going to create a file to specify all of our requirements. It will very creatively be named requirements.txt. And in it, we're going to list Flask and requests. And then when we're back in our terminal, we're going to run pip install -r requirements.txt. It's important that we're running this inside of our virtual environment. Otherwise, we'd be installing to our system default Python, which we probably don't want to do. All right, everything's installed. So we can go back into VS Code and actually build our server. So the very first thing we're going to do is create a file, and let's call it server.py. And we're going to put most of our logic here. Now we've already seen what it takes to build a Flask application. We're going to run the standard from Flask, import Flask, and then we're going to say app is equal to Flask name, and there's your standard Flask starter. Now we're going to have to write some code to fetch the data from our API. So let's take a quick look at our API and how that works. Here I've pulled up the API we're using from financialmodelingprep.com, and it basically just gives us an endpoint that gives us the price in JSON form. And all we have to do is just change the ticker there. Now, if you want to use this for stocks other than Apple, you're going to have to use a different API key, and you can register for a free API key on their website. For now, we're just going to be using Apple with the demo API key. We're going to have to write a function to actually get that data. So let's go ahead and do that in our editor. The very first thing we're going to want is we're going to need to specify the API URL. So here I've entered our API URL, and I've noticed that this is the thing that we're going to change in each request. Next up, we're going to have to import the request library in order to actually make requests. And then we can write a function called fetch price that takes in a ticker and gets the data from the API. So we're going to do request.get and API URL, and we're going to format it so with ticker is going to be equal to the ticker that we were passed in here, and maybe we want to do params, And this is where we're going to pass in the API key. So API key is demo. And then we'll probably want the JSON data there. And then to be safe, let's go ahead and uppercase this string. So that'll make sure we're in the right format at all times. Okay, so at this point, data should be a dictionary that looks like this. And so we want to index into that price key. So data price is what we want to return. Now we can verify that this works by going back into our terminal and running what we just created in interactive mode. So we wrote this function called fetch price. Let's fetch AAPL. Okay, cool. So it returns the right value. Now going back here, let's go ahead and write a Flask function to, or let's just write a function to start with that takes in a ticker and returns the string we want to return. So maybe we'll say the price is equal to fetch price of the ticker, and we're going to return a string. The price of ticker is going to be the price, and we're going to format that with ticker is equal to ticker and price is equal to price. Okay, so this is a function, and the function seems like it'll work, but we need a way to get it to be a URL. So our application is initially going to be hosted here, localhost 5000 stock AAPL. So how do we get Flask to render that? Well, we've also already seen this app.route/, but that doesn't give us any ticker that we can pass in. So the way we want to do that is we can specify an argument here. And so by specifying this argument, Flask will pass whatever gets matched in this route to the first argument there. Now we want it to be stock/ticker. So let's go ahead and do that. And just to be safe, let's add another route that says homepage try/stock/apple for now. All right, so we have a Flask application. Now our job is to run it and test it out. So let's go back in our terminal and define our variables. We want to say Flask app is in server, maybe Flask end is equal to development, and then Flask run. Okay, so our Flask app is running now. Let's go ahead and go to Firefox, and let's go to localhost 5000. Localhost 5000. Okay, so it sent us to that URL, which told us we hit the wrong URL. So then let's go back here, and it worked. So it said the price of Apple is $499.72. Now I could try some other stocks, but our API key is invalid for those, so we can't do that. If we had a valid API key, it would have worked. So hopefully we now have a Flask app that we can work with, and you were able to get to this point. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the forum. But if not, over the next few videos, we're going to be enhancing the core of this application to first off look a little better, but also to have a little more functionality as well. Now that we have a semi-working Flask application that renders stock prices like this, let's think about how we can get this up and running on the internet. To do that, we're going to use Heroku. Heroku is a platform as a service that allows us to easily spin up and launch applications without worrying about the underlying hosting. You can learn more about them and register for an account at their website. And there's a lot of other similar services. For this case, we're going to use Heroku as a quick way to launch a test application. So our very first thing is going to go ahead and be installing Heroku. I'm going to go ahead and run the script that will install Heroku in my environment here, but you can find information for your own environment on the Heroku website as well. Once we've installed Heroku, we're going to have to go ahead and log into Heroku, and the command to do that is essentially just Heroku login. Once you've done that, you're going to be prompted for your application credentials. So let's see if we do this, and this is going to open up my browser and it's going to ask me to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, I'm in. So now that we're here, we're going to have to create a file that tells Heroku how we want our application to be deployed. And to do that, we're going to create a file called a proc file. And the proc file essentially tells Heroku what command it needs to run. So let's go back in our VS Code editor and go ahead and create that file. What we want to do is run a production version of our server. To date, we've been running using the Flask development server, but that's not really suited for a production use case. So we're going to have to install another server called Gunicorn that's more designed for production use cases. We'll go into more details about why it's useful later. So now that we've set up Gunicorn, let's go ahead and create a file called a proc file. And the proc file essentially gives this command that we want to run. So we're telling Heroku that in order to run our web server named web here, which is what Heroku looks for by default, it's going to have to run this command called Gunicorn bind to all port, to like listen on this port, server, and with this log level. This part is telling that our Flask application is defined in the server module with that variable name app. Let's go ahead and try this on our own terminal. The very first step we're going to have to do is we're going to have to install our requirements. We just added a new one there, so we're going to want to add Gunicorn to our requirements. Okay, then the next one is let's just set a port here. So let's say our port is going to be 5001. So let's try this out. If I run this command, Gunicorn is now listening at 5001. So we can go back into Firefox and check out what's going on localhost 5001. There's our application. And then we can check that it's running here. And our application is no longer running localhost 5000. That page just won't load because we've told Gunicorn to listen on 5001 and look for our app inside of the stock module or the server module. All right, so here we have our file. Once we have this proc file, that's basically it. Heroku will auto detect everything else and then we'll be good to go. All right, let's go back in our terminal and let's run the next few steps to get Heroku going here. All right, so I hit Control-C to get a Gunicorn server, and let's go run Heroku create. What this does, it'll create a quick application for us, and then we can initialize what's called a Git repository here. So we can say git init here and git status. So we want to git add proc file requirements and server.txt. We don't want to commit the cache file or the end files. That's not really important. And then we can do git status, and then we want to do git commit -m, our first commit. Okay, great. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and say git push Heroku. Actually, let's check if that. Okay, so we don't have any remotes yet, so we're going to copy this URL that Heroku gave us and add that as a remote. So we're going to say git remote add Heroku, and so that's the name of the remote we're adding. Then we're going to paste that git URL they gave us. All right, now that we had that, now we can run git push Heroku master. So we're pushing the name of the current branch onto Heroku, and we're basically telling Heroku what we want is it to deploy this current repository. At least I would tell everything we've committed. And you can tell that it automatically detects that we're using Python. We never told it we're using Python, but Heroku figured that out. And it's installing everything specified in our requirements.txt file because that's a convention, and so Heroku knows well enough that we need to be installing that to run our application. So All right, so it's told us that it's done. So let's go ahead and go into Firefox and try load this page. So I'm here and it looks like we have everything running. So let's try stock AAPL. Awesome. So we now have our very first production application running on Heroku, and you can actually share this with your friends or anyone else that you now have a production application running on the internet using Flask. In the next few videos, we're going to continue to build out the functionality here. In this video, we're going to cover how to make our stock ticker application look a little better by using templating. Right now, everything we've done to date within our Flask applications has involved returning a string directly from our function, and it ends up looking something like this. So this technically works, but it just doesn't look very good. We'll probably want to make our pages look better, something like this. And to do that, we're going to have to use HTML. A really basic, but still improvement on our existing version is to return a very basic HTML document. Now, we wouldn't want to construct this entire string right within our Python file. You can imagine how that would get messy if our documents got any more complicated than this. So what we're going to use are template files. Flask has some built-in tools here to make this easy for us. Let's take a look at what our existing application looks like right now and what we will eventually turn it into is something that looks more like this. All right, so in VS Code, we're going to do a few things. First off is we're going to create a folder called templates. And templates folder is where Flask is going to go to look for our HTML template files. Then we're going to create a file within it, and let's call this one stockquote.html. And within this, let's define some basic content. So we're going to need to have a title for our document. I'm going to call mine AAPL stock quote. All right, so we have a title, and we're going to need a body as well. And for that body, we can put an H1 tag in there saying the price is $XYZ. And obviously, this company will also change. So we're going to maybe say question mark there for now. Now let's make sure our server actually uses this. And to do that, we're going to have to import this render template file function from Flask. So to do that, we're going to import render template and then reference the relative path of stockquote.html in the templates folder. So that's just stockquote.html. So let's try that and actually look at what our application looks like now. Okay, so we got our templates to be rendering. Going back in VS Code, we actually want our template to be dynamic. And so the way we can do that is Flask uses a templating language called Jinja, which allows us to insert variables into our template using the syntax. So maybe we'll call this one ticker, and we can do something like this. And then we can say stock price. All right, so to do that, now we're gonna have to pass in those variables. Jinja does not automatically get access to everything that's defined within the function. We actually have to explicitly pass that in. So we'll say the ticker is equal to the ticker and the stock price is the price. All right, so let's see what happens in Firefox now. All right, that looks pretty good. One thing we can do as a small improvement is we can do uppercasing here, and our template looks a little better now that we consider it. Okay, so our document looks okay, I guess, but it still could be better. One thing we can do to make it better is import some default styling, like fonts and other things. So the way we can do that is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a CSS library called Bootstrap to provide us with some same defaults values. So once I've added that to our head, we can check our terminal and see what it looks like. Okay, so it's given us a better font, so it looks a little better, but we're still gonna have to do more work on the layout. Okay, let's add some bootstrap styling by default. Maybe the first thing I'll add is a nav bar. So this nav bar will make our page look a little better. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then we'll add some center content. And I'm just gonna create a bootstrap row here that looks like this. Okay, so that looks a lot better. Maybe we can add some margin here too. And then we see here, we have a page that looks a lot better. Now let's go ahead and think about our homepage. If we go to localhost, the homepage gives us a pretty useless page. Let's go ahead and think about what we could add here. One thing that would be useful is just some links to other pages, or perhaps just a homepage to say what the application does. So let's call this our homepage, or maybe index.html, and then we can copy paste all of this logic here, which is a little duplicative here. So we're going to address that in a moment. And once we've set that up, we now have a homepage that we can render. So going back in server.html, instead of returning try stock app, a string right there, we're going to return index.html. Now there's no variables in here once we remove this. So if we call this just stock app and we refresh and go back to Firefox, it looks something like this. I forgot a container, so let's go back into our code base and add that. But while we're here, let's talk about how the logic is really duplicative here. There's a lot of stuff that is duplicated between the two pages, and really the only part that's unique is maybe this part right here. Everything else is basically the same, and maybe there's some differences in the title. One other note I'll make is that Jinja allows variables to be undefined. So for example, if I kept that ticker reference there and we went back into Firefox, you'll notice that it worked just fine. And that's because it evaluated it to none, and Jinja just left it blank. So we don't need that for now, so let's leave it here. We have a working application, but there's some code duplication. So let's think about how we can solve some of that by using layouts. So what we want to do is we want to create something that essentially allows us to predefine the fixed parts and allow each template to define the part that makes them unique. So let's go ahead and create a new file. We're going to call it baselayout.html. And in the base layout, we're going to copy the entire file and just leave out the part that is unique to our templates. All right, so we already know, looking at both of our templates, that the container is going to be there for both. And we probably want to define a margin on the container as well. So we might as well just define that in our base layout as well. So we're going to say div container, and we're going to define some margin there. All right, now we want to tell Jinja that this space is something that we think should be templated in. So the way we're going to do that is by defining a block in Jinja. And we're going to say the templates that use this layout will give us some content in this block. Similarly, we're going to do something on the title, because the title is going to change for each page. So we're going to call this block the title block. But unlike the content block, we're going to provide a default value. So we're going to say view stock prices. So if a template doesn't tell us what's supposed to be in the title block, it'll just use that. And then maybe we can add a postfix there called stock app. All right, so we now have a base layout. Let's try and make our templates use that. So going into index.html, in order to use the template, we're going to do a few things. The first one is that we're going to indicate that this page actually uses that layout. And so we're going to say extends the base layout.html. That tells Jinja that it's supposed to look at the base layout there to figure out what's going on. Then we're going to define maybe a title. So we can say like homepage for now. All right. And then we're using these Jinja block tags to define what goes in there. So similarly for content, we're just going to define the parts that are specific to our app. So none of this stuff is specific to our app. Really, it's only just this. So we can go ahead and define that here. Okay, so we now have a application that uses the base layout. Let's go into Firefox and see if this worked. Okay, so I just refreshed the page and it worked. And if we look at the source code, it's exactly like you'd expect. This template has been substituted in where we expected it to be. Let's go and do the same thing for our stock quote page. I'm just going to copy all of this content and replace it with appropriate values. So for this one, for the title, we want it to be this, and for the content that's unique, it's really just this content. Now you might be wondering, we defined this row class in both of them. Would we want to define it globally? It just so happens that both of these use the row class, but I don't think every single page will start with a row. So we don't want to constrain ourselves too much by adding that in the base layout. Okay, so now both of our applications use templates here. So if we go to stock AAPL, that also uses a template and it's substituted in exactly like you'd expect. In the last video, we covered how the basics of templating works. In this one, we're going to dig deeper into it and clean up our code a little bit, as well as add more functionality. So looking at our current application, this works, but there's actually no links. So if I go to stock/Apple, there's actually no way for me to go to the home page. And if on the home page, there's no way for me to end up on that stock quote page. So let's fix that. First off, the fix for our application to have a link is fairly straightforward. What we want to do is we want to add a link here on the page. So we want to do a href and we want to link to stock/APL. So if we do this, this will technically work. And if we go here, this will now be a link to stock/Apple, for example. But it's not a great idea that we're hard coding all of these links. And in fact, this one shouldn't even go to stock/Apple. It should just go to the URL of the homepage. The way we can do that is we can use a function in Flask called URL_for. And what URL_for does is it takes in the name of the route, meaning stock or homepage here in our case, and then generates the appropriate relative URL for that page. So here, if I say that this should be URL for homepage, this will now in Firefox point to the homepage. And we can check that as well as by going to this. And if we refresh and click on this, we're taken back to the homepage. Okay, so that's solved right there. The next one we want to do is add more content to the homepage to show our stocks, essentially, that we are tracking. So to do that, we're going to add another column on our homepage here. We're going to say, and for that, what we want to do is add a list. So maybe we'll say something like this, li view APL. And similarly, we can do that for other stocks. So we can say view Google or view Facebook. And if we go back in our browser and refresh, we get these. But these aren't links. So going back into our code, we're going to actually have to link these. So we can say href equals something, and we can put view APL in there. And what we want here is a URL_for. And the name of the route that we're looking for is called stock. So we're going to say URL for stock, and this one accepts parameters, as you can see right here. So for that one, we're going to say ticker is equal to AAPL. And then we're going to close the Jinja formatting block. And now we're good to go. So we can do that similarly for the other two and say this will be Google and this one will be Facebook. Now on our browser, if we refresh the page, these are now proper links and we can go back to the home page. Now one thing I like is to be able to view the stocks also on the individual stock page so that I can quickly navigate. To do that, what we can do is we can take this code here and copy paste it into the logic there, but that's a little duplicative. So let's go ahead and create a new partial where we can just define this logic once. And what we can do is we can use a feature in Jinja to include another template. So we can call this one maybe portfolio.html. And within portfolio.html, we can just define these things. Maybe we don't want to define the column because that will be up to the users of this partial to say where it goes. But one thing we can define is maybe H2 here that says your portfolio. All right, so this is a partial here that we can use inside of our templates. So within stock quote, instead of duplicating this logic, what I can do here is I can just say include portfolio.html. And now if we go back into Firefox, we'll see if this works. Okay, so now we see this partial here, and then let's go back into VS Code and also do this on our index page so we avoid some code duplication there. Okay, so now our homepage also uses this logic. One other thing I'd like to fix is there's no indication of what page we're on up here in the nav bar. We should probably add a link to home because it might not be obvious that you have to click on this to go back home. So going back in our text editor, the way we can edit that is we can edit the base layout and change the nav bar there. So there we're going to insert some basic Bootstrap syntax to get a nav bar link. Okay, here's that syntax for our Bootstrap link. So all it does is adds a link to the nav bar. If we go back here, you can see that there's a link to home, and similarly on here, we can link to home. Now, one thing we can do in our template is we can actually add a class to this navbar element and mark it as active. So if we add it as active, the color changes a little bit and becomes a little more obvious, especially when there's more links here, that this is the currently selected tab. So to do that in Jinja, we could say active here, but we don't want that to apply all the time. So to avoid that, what we'll do is we'll add an if statement. And we can do an if statement like so. We can say if true and if some content. And in Firefox, we can see what that looks like. So it says some content. Now, we don't want if true. Instead, we want to check if the current route is equal to a specific URL. So we can say request.url rule.endpoint is equal to home page. And then if that's the case, what we want to do is we want to add the active class. And we can actually just put that right there and say, if it's active, include it, otherwise don't. And now we can try what that looks like in Firefox. And when we're on the home page, that link is not marked as active. And when we are, it is marked as active. Okay. Now, one other thing has been bugging me, which is that this code is a little repetitive in itself too, and it becomes annoying if we want to add new documents. For example, I want to do this, I have to change this, and it's not easy to do that. So instead, what we want to do is maybe add a for loop. So we've seen what if blocks look like. For loops look similar and to the syntax in Python. So here we can say for ticker in some list of tickers, and then say end if and for. And so here we can say AAPL, Facebook, Google. Maybe we'll add another stock in there as well. Right. And here, instead of saying AAPL, we want to pass in ticker here, and then we can directly reference ticker since we're already inside of an evaluation block there. All right, and then looking back at Firefox, we now have that portfolio be reflected everywhere. So you can see some of the beauty of partials is that we only had to change things once. And everywhere we changed it once, it flows through to the rest of the app. And that's really powerful, and having to manage all of that stuff individually is obviously pretty painful. One other tool that's useful inside of Jinja is filters to control how things are formatted. So if you remember early in server.py, we had to pass in the uppercase version of ticker. Now it's not always possible that we'll be able to format the logic inside of our Python code. And we might not even want to format it inside of our Python code. Instead, that should be up to the template, and it should decide how it wants to format itself. So here, what we can do is, inside of the stock quote, right now, if I go to Firefox and I load AAPL like this, it looks fine. But if I load it like this with lowercasing, it loads the lowercase version. And instead of doing that in Python, what we can do is we can use a Jinja filter. And so the Jinja filter here is essentially to use title case or uppercase here. So we want to use a Jinja filter, and we have one that's called upper. And all we have to do is use that filter syntax there. And then going back in Firefox, we can see that it filters itself, right? Like so. And we're not just limited to filters. For example, we can work with floats as well. So if I want to round stock prices for some reason, I can do that. So I added a round filter there, and it appropriately added the right number of rounding. So we can also round to like specific digits of precision and pass in additional arguments as well. And you can see how that might impact the price that we display there. So I'm going to change that to round to and to floor so that we can guarantee we're always getting up to 2 digits of precision. And there are other things as well too, and you can actually define your own filters as well. So some of those details are in the manuscript. Now, because this is a Python, this ticker is a Python object, we could have also just called the Python method upper, which is a different method, and that would have worked too. But I like using the Jinja filter syntax so that it's clear what's going on. One really useful filter is the default filter. So we could say something like, let's say if we had a company name and we created a filter called company name, but we don't know if that's going to be passed in all the time, or it might evaluate to none. So we might say something like this so that it's unknown. And then if we check back in Firefox, we can see that it passes in as unknown. If we didn't use that default filter, it just would have looked blank. And that's not quite as great. So default comes in handy pretty often. All right, the last thing that we might do a lot in our template is that we're going to link to stock quotes probably all the time, not just in here, but all over our application. So it's going to be useful if we have a quicker way of doing that rather than writing all of this code out instead. For example, it'd be nice if we can just say stock quote link or something and pass in a ticker like AAPL or something like that. And if we just did that, and it would return us the logic to return a link. And that's possible using macros in Jinja. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file called macros.html. And in that file, we're actually going to define a macro. So the process of doing that is we're going to define a macro and the name of the macro. So I'm going to call that stock quote link. And then I'm going to pass in a stock ticker and define that block and macro. And then within the block, it just defines exactly what we want to link to. So here we're going to add a link to the stock price, and this is going to be view stock for us. And we can show that it shows stock ticker. Maybe let's make this say view Apple. Okay, now to use that within our templates, what we want to do is we want to import that macro wherever we use it. So right now the only place we use this link is in the portfolio. So what we want to do is we want to say from macros.html import stock quote link. Now, if this reminds you of Python a lot, it kind of is. It kind of intentionally resembles Python, but it's not exactly Python because it's being interpreted through Jinja. All right, so we want to do stock quote link here and then just pass in ticker. All right, let's check out if that worked. Okay, so without refreshing this page and the home page, they still work. And now if we decide that we don't want view to be in the link, what we can do is just change the macro once and it's no longer in the link. And instead, we can see something like this. And now in Firefox, it looks like this. Great. So those covers all of the basics around macros and partials that will help you be productive in building HTML documents. There are a few questions in the manuscript that you can use to check your understanding of filters. And there's a few extra projects as well that you can think about doing to improve this application from here. Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to talk about blueprints as a better way to organize our Flask application as it grows. Now, to date, everything we've done has been inside of a single file inside of server.py here. Now, you can imagine that as we scale, we don't want to put all of our code into one large Flask file. Some of the hardest to maintain Flask applications I've worked with have just been massive single file Flask servers. And there's just a lot of logic all over the place, and it's hard to maintain. So instead, we'll use something that Flask provides called blueprints to organize our routes and collections. They make a lot of sense when we have applications that have components that are fairly discrete. For example, if you have an administrative side of your application that's only accessible to employees at your company, for example, it makes sense to make that a separate blueprint and separate that out from the more user-facing side of your application, which could live in another blueprint. A common misconception is that Flask blueprints are separate Flask applications, and that's not quite true. Instead, the way you want to think of blueprints is that they're actually just a collection of routes that can be imported into your application and be registered accordingly. Okay, so let's get started, and we're going to add blueprints into our application. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a blueprints folder in our application. And then within that, we can think about what our existing blueprints are. So we're probably going to add a lot of functionality on the stock side of this application. So will make sense to have a stock.py blueprint. And the other side of our application is more like the homepage stuff. So maybe eventually we'll start a homepage blueprint. But for now, let's think about the stocks blueprint. So when we're starting off a blueprint, what we want to do is import that function, that class from Flask. So in our server, before we used to import Flask and create an application to which we're registering routes. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to import a blueprint, and we're going to set up a blueprint. Let's call our blueprint stock here. Then we're going to initialize a blueprint. And we're going to give this blueprint a name. The name that we're filling out here is going to be the name that we're going to refer to it in the rest of our application as anytime we're constructing URLs or trying to route to a specific route in this blueprint. So I'm going to call mine stock. And we also have to pass in an import name, which is the name of the module that we're in. So similarly to how we did it in Flask, we're going to use the module name. And then here, the last argument is, there's a bunch of optional arguments here. So you can see all of those arguments here, including a custom template folder, potentially a subdomain, but the one we're going to specify here is actually a URL prefix. So we want all of the routes in this blueprint to be prefixed with /doc. What that'll mean is we don't have to reference /doc in every single route we define here. So what we can then do is we can take this logic we had here and move that into here. And now instead of app.route, this just becomes doc.route. And instead of /doc, we can change this to be just /ticker because the URL prefix will take care of making that /doc. And then this can stay. We probably don't want to define this as stock since that's the name of our blueprint, so we can call this quote, for example. Okay, so now that we have that, we're also going to have to define the fetch price function. So it probably makes sense to have the fetch price function live in a separate file, maybe like a utils file. But for the sake of example, we're just going to put it in the controller for now. And so we import requests. Okay, so we've actually just created our blueprint right here. So our next step is to delete all of the code that we've created here that we don't need anymore. So we don't need this, and we don't need any of this logic either. Now what we want to do is we actually just want to import our blueprint here. So what we can do to do that is we can say from blueprints.stock import stock. And what we're doing there is we're importing this variable here. Now it's best practice to create a module file here, just an empty init.py file, so that it's more easily recognized as an import. All right, so blueprint.stock import stock. Now that we have the blueprint, we want to go and register that blueprint. So the way we can do that is there's a function on Flask called register blueprint. And all we have to do is pass in a blueprint. Okay, so at this point, we can try running our application and see what happens. And the short answer is, I think it's going to crash. So if we refresh our page here, okay, well, that one's an easy one to fix. We also need to import render template. Now going back here, now it's complaining about this URL. Could not build URL for endpoint stock with values ticker. Did you mean stock.quote instead? And the debugger is right. We did mean stock.quote. And looking at the traceback, we can find exactly where we did that. So our macros file has us going URL for stock. And that's not what we want to do. So we want to do URL for stock.quote instead. All right, let's try now. All right, so this works. So if we're here, we can now go back to our application and there's a blueprint. But while we're back on VS Code, now that we changed this to look at stock.quote, we actually, looking at this template structure, we actually probably want to organize it a little better. Good practice is we're going to create a template folder for each of the blueprints. So we created a blueprint named stock.py, and then what we should do is we should move the template inside of there. So I'm going to move stock.quote inside of there. Okay, now that's here, maybe we can rename this to be just quote.html to better match the name of the template. Then here, what we're going to have to do is we're going to say stock quote. And the reason we have to do stock/quote is because when we do render template, by default, it's always looking in the templates folder for everything. So when we say stock quote, that way it knows where to go. All right, let's check out Firefox and see if it worked. Okay, looks like it still works. Now that we're looking at server.py, it looks so much neater. all of the complexity of how to view a stock quote is moved out of there, and this application is simple to understand. Now, if we want to add another feature, it's relatively simple. The feature I'm thinking about is the one to view a company's financials. So our API that we're using also provides us with an endpoint to view a company's quarterly financials, and it'd be neat if we can bring that into our application as well. So to do that, first off, we're going to have to write some code to fetch that data from our server. So let's do that, and then also define a new route. So this function is going to be called fetch income. And so I've pasted in the code here. You can find that as well, but it basically does the same thing that we've seen above, but it specifically grabs the financial data for a company's quarterly results. So what we want to do here is define a new route, stock.route, and we'll call this tickers and then maybe /financials. So once we're here, we can call this financials. Again, it takes in a ticker. One thing we can do to specify the type is we can say string ticker, just to be extra explicit there. Okay, and then we can say our data is equal to fetch income ticker. Now, one thing that's making me a little uncomfortable is I think we should move this into its own separate utility file. Now that it's getting pretty complicated, we generally want to keep blueprints to simply the logic to render the template. Stuff like this, where you're making API requests, should really be in a separate module. But for the sake of our example here, I'm going to stuff that under the rug there and just collapse those functions. Okay, then what we want to do is we essentially just render the details of the template. So we want to return maybe a template, which we'll have to create. So we'll create a new one, stock financials.html. Probably want to pass in the ticker, and we'll also probably want to pass the data there as financials. Okay, so let's create that template. Financials.html. All right, inside of financials.html, we want to define the same initial set of things. So we want to say that it comes from base layout and it defines the financials. Now that we've had this, we can actually load the financials page. There won't be anything on it, but it's just a good way to verify that it works. So if we go here and say financials, and we fix a syntax error, then we should be good to go. All right, now that we've fixed the syntax error, we see that the page actually renders. There's just no content yet because on the financials template, we haven't defined the content block. Okay, so the content block I'm thinking of is essentially a table. So to start off with, I think the table contains a few fields. Let's go there and then end block. And then what we can do here is we can render the details of the financials here so we can see exactly what that looks like. All right, going back to our browser, we see here there's a table and then there's these dates and data. And it's basically the data we saw in this JSON file here. So we can use a for loop here to render our rows. So here's our table that we want. Let's see what that looks like in Firefox. Cool. So that's essentially our table right there. Welcome back. We're going to continue off where we left in the last video, working with blueprints, and we're going to extend the functionality of our stock application. There are a few things missing in the stock application, one of which is namely the ability to go and look up a specific stock. If you land on this page, it's not obvious how you get to the next one and look up a specific stock ticker. For example, If I wanted to look up Microsoft, it's unclear how I'd do that. Then if we go to the financials page of the application, this page doesn't look very nice. It's basically just a lot of numbers. A chart might be useful here. So we're going to add both of those things in our application. The first step we're going to do is we're going to go back to our text editor here and go ahead and add a blueprint specifically for our home route, because we're going to add a little more functionality here. So we're going to create a new file. I'm going to call it home.py, and I'm also going to create a new folder in templates called home, where I'm going to move the index file. And so now that I've moved the index file, that makes things a little easier. And the other one I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder as well for shared files. So portfolio is an example of something that is shared, and everywhere I use portfolio right now, so if I search portfolio.html right here, we're going to have to change that to be shared/portfolio.html. All right, so we've done a little bit of reorganization. Let's go ahead and define a blueprint here. So exactly what we saw before from Flask import blueprint, and this time we're going to call this one home, which we can specify here, and a name, and we don't need a URL prefix here since this is defining the root of the application. So let's go ahead and take some of that code out of server.py and move it here, and then this becomes home. And then we change this to be home/index.py. Going back in server.py, we're going to go ahead and import home there, and then we're going to register home as well. Now, one note while we're talking about blueprints, in the stock blueprint, we define the URL prefix in the blueprint itself. Another way you could do this is actually to go inside of server and then define the URL prefix there too. Either one is valid. Personally, I prefer this style because it's obvious when you look at server.py which route goes where. All right, let's take a quick sanity check and make sure our application works. Okay, looks like there's an error on the page because we forgot to edit some templates. Let's find out where it is. So it looks like it's going for base layout URL for homepage. So let's change that. So we do home.homepage, and we'll just have to replace that everywhere we use it. And we ran into the same error we did last time, which is that we want to import render template as well. All right, so if we go there, we can see everything works as expected. So I'm thinking we can add a search bar over here that looks like that. So to do that, let's go to VS Code, and then let's go ahead and add in a few things to the nav bar. For example, I think we should write a form. And so we can create a form tag here, and the form should make a post request to some URL, which we'll define in a bit. And the form should have a specific action, maybe input that says type input, and maybe we give it a name. And maybe then we want to do a button to submit. So type is equal to submit, and we'll give that a lookup name. All right, let's see what that does to our browser. So here we get this form, and then it creates post requests. However, it goes to some URL which doesn't accept post requests. So we're going to have to go ahead and create one that does. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new route. Let's call this route lookup, and it's going to accept post requests. So here we're going to say method is. Okay, so we've created this lookup method here, and then we can say home.route, and we can give it to a specific URL. So maybe /lookup, and we want to specify that it's only going to accept post requests. And then what we want to do is we want to make it return a redirect. We want it to take to the stock quote page. So if we just did URL for stock.view, what do we call it, quote, and ticker is equal to request.form ticker. So that'll just return a string. And what we actually want to do is return a redirect. So the way we do that is by using the redirect function within Flask, which returns a HTTP redirect to this URL. So it's redirecting to stock.quote, which is here, and it's passing in the ticker argument as request.form. So whatever data we got in request.form, which we can print here, request.form, it'll send over. Okay, let's make our nav bar actually use that now. So here we want to say URL for home.lookup. And that's about it. So this should give us something that works. One more thing we'll need is that we use the request variable here in home, and that's something we also have to import from Flask. So the request variable has a bunch of information about the request that Flask exposes to us when a request is actually happening. Okay, going back to Firefox now, if we go and type AAPL here, that should take us to the right URL. And it looks like we forgot one more thing, which is the URL for method. All right, so I can now type in other URLs. So I went to Facebook. That page didn't load, but that's because our API key was not valid. And I can also go from the home page and type AAPL here, and it takes me to the right route. So that's good. One thing we can do quickly to improve the UI here a little bit is to add some better Bootstrap styling. So here in base layout, this is a very simple form. Instead, let's make it a little bit fancier by adding some classes as well as some accessibility values here. So now that we've done that, if we look at Firefox, we can see here that the form looks a little bit better, and it actually has a placeholder among other information. All right, now that we have a working lookup function, one thing we can consider is improving this page. Now there's a bunch of formatting things we can improve by using Jinja filters, but just on an overall level, a chart seems like it's the right idea here. And we can actually use an API that gives us charts here. So all we have to do is load an image and pass in the right set of data here to render that chart. So if we go back into our code and specifically try and find the kind of data we'll need there, essentially we'll want to render a line chart. And the chart data, for example, we might want to do the earnings per share and just map that quarter over quarter. And to get that in the format that this charting API wants, we're going to have to go ahead and go into stock and format the data a little bit. So I'm going to use some list comprehensions here from Python in VS Code to add some additional information. So here we've got the EPS for every quarter, and we've got the labels corresponding to every quarter here as well. And so now that we have that, we essentially need to pass this chart parameters into our template. So we can say chart params is equal to chart params. Now this line is getting long, so let's format a little bit. Okay, so now in our financials page under the stock template, what we want to do is we want to actually just render a new row here. So we will say row, and we'll say, and we'll give some margin for the image there. And then essentially what we want to do is render an image. And using the API that we've been given from QuickChart, we essentially just want to pass the data in the C parameter. So the way we can do that is essentially just to render the chart params here. So we take this and we say chart params, and then we close off the image tag. All right, let's see if that worked. Okay, so I used the data variable here, and just confirming going into Firefox, when we refresh the page, it actually shows us the EPS chart like we expect, and we can quickly spot that outlier of a chapter here in 2014, rather than just trying to have to scroll through all of this data. Now, one thing you might notice is this chart is backwards. So if we want to reverse it, there's an easy way for us to do that. So here in Jinja, one way we could do that is use the Python list indexing approach to reverse it, or we can just use a Jinja filter called reverse. And once we do that and refresh the page, it'll show us in the most recent order. Another thing we can consider is the revenue number formatting here, as well as the gross margin percent. This should probably say 38.36%. I'm not totally sure what's going on with the API here that's giving this result, but regardless, we should give it a shot to format our results cleanly. So hopping back into our code, the very first thing we're going to want to do is convert all of these values to floats. And the way we do that is by using the float filter in Jinja. Now at this point, this is a value. So what we can do is if we wanted to multiply this number by 100, we could do that. So we could just say times 100. And for this one, since this is also a value, we can apply some Python string formatting. So I'm going to type in the format string for a comma separated number with 0 digits of precision. And what we can do is we can actually pass this value in to the function. And this doesn't look like Python, and that's because it's not really Python. It's Jinja that's doing a lot of the interpretation here. So, and then the last thing we'll want to do is adding some rounding here. So once we multiply this number by 100, we'll probably want to round that to maybe 2 digits. We'll also want to add a $, which this will take care of in front of the revenue number. And once we refresh the page, we can see that the revenue number is well formatted and the gross margin shows up. As a last step, let's add a % near the end as a finishing touch. Great, so this page looks a lot better now.